The unthinkable just happened. J.D. Vance walked to a microphone and did what every European leader swore would never happen. He pulled the United States out of the most powerful military alliance in human history. 75 years of NATO, 75 years of American blood, American treasure, and American sacrifice holding the Western world together. Gone, dissolved, buried in a single announcement that sent shockwaves from Washington to Warsaw, from Berlin to Brussels. Ursula von der Leyen's hands were shaking. Defense ministers were scrambling for their phones. And somewhere in the Kremlin, the lights were burning very, very late. This is the moment, yet the world order died. The date was etched into history before the sun had even finished rising over the Atlantic. April 2026. A month that will be studied in war colleges, debated in parliaments, and whispered about in the corridors of power for generations to come. Because on this day, the United States of America did not simply change its foreign policy, it detonated it. It buried 75 years of carefully constructed alliances under an avalanche of cold, calculated decisions that left the entire European establishment gasping for air and staring into an abyss they never believed they would see in their lifetimes. J.D. Vance did not arrive at the podium with the posture of a diplomat. He arrived with the posture of a man who had already made his decision, signed the paperwork, and was simply informing the world of what had already been done. There were no pleasantries, no ceremonial nods to the enduring bonds of the transatlantic relationship, no careful diplomatic language designed to soften the blow. He stood before the cameras, looked directly into the eyes of a stunned global press corps, and began dismantling the architecture of the Western world with the calm, methodical efficiency of a man who had been waiting a very long time to say what he was about to say. For decades, the leaders of Europe operated under an assumption so deeply embedded in their political DNA that they never once stopped to question it. They assumed that America would always be there, that the nuclear umbrella would always be open, that the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers stationed across their continent were as permanent a feature of European life as the Rhine River or the Alps. They built their entire post-war civilization on that assumption. They defunded their militaries. They redirected defense budgets into lavish welfare states. They lectured Washington on the rules of international order while simultaneously refusing to pay for the enforcers of that order. They attended summit after summit, signed declaration after declaration, and gave speech after speech about European values and multilateral cooperation, all while the American taxpayer quietly picked up the bill for their security and asked for nothing in return except basic respect. They couldn't even manage that. Vance opened his statement with a phrase that immediately sucked the air out of the room. He said, and these words will echo through history, "The United States of America hereby formally initiates the process of withdrawal from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, effective immediately." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt like 4 decades. Ambassadors looked at each other. Translators paused mid-sentence. The German delegation sat frozen. The French representative's pen dropped from his hand and clattered against the marble floor. And in that silence, every person in that room understood simultaneously that the world they had woken up in that morning no longer existed. NATO, the alliance forged from the smoking ruins of World War II, built on the solemn promise that an attack on one member is an attack on all. The alliance that had kept Soviet tanks from rolling into Paris, that had held the line through the Cold War, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the chaos of the post-9/11 era, and the resurgence of Russian aggression in Ukraine, was now being legally, formally, and permanently dissolved by the nation that had built it, funded it, led it, and held it together through every crisis it had ever faced. Vance was not finished. He had only just begun. He then turned to the numbers, and the numbers were catastrophic. The United States, he announced, would immediately begin the suspension of all financial contributions to the NATO Common Fund. This is not a small line item. American contributions represent nearly 70% of NATO's total operational budget. Without that money, the alliance's command infrastructure, its rapid reaction capabilities, its joint logistics networks, its satellite communication systems, all of it begins to collapse within months. European members had been warned for years through 4 American administrations that this moment was coming if they refused to meet their defense spending commitments. Most of them still hadn't. And now the warning had expired, and the consequences had arrived, not as a future threat, but as a present reality landing on their desks like a wrecking ball through a glass ceiling. But Vance didn't stop at the money. The financial suspension was merely the opening act of an announcement that grew darker and more devastating with every sentence. He revealed that the United States would simultaneously be recalling its senior military commanders from all NATO Joint Command positions. Every American general, every American admiral, every American strategic planner embedded in NATO's command structure across Europe would be withdrawn within 90 days. These are the individuals who hold the institutional knowledge, the operational relationships, the classified protocols, and the strategic muscle memory that make NATO function as a coherent fighting force rather than a collection of disconnected national armies that speak different languages and operate incompatible equipment. Without them, NATO doesn't just weaken, it loses its mind. European defense chiefs who spent the morning reviewing their operational readiness reports were, by afternoon, staring at a completely different strategic reality. The alliance they had relied upon to coordinate their defenses, to integrate their command systems, to synchronize their responses to threats along NATO's eastern flank was now operating on borrowed time and running on empty. And every defense minister on the continent knew, even if they were not yet ready to admit it publicly, that none of their nations had the individual capacity to fill the void that America was leaving behind. The panic didn't stay behind closed doors for long. Within hours of Vance's announcement, extraordinary scenes were unfolding across European capitals that would have seemed utterly unimaginable just 24 hours earlier. In Berlin, the German Chancellor convened an emergency session of the Bundestag, interrupting a scheduled debate on climate policy to address what one senior government official privately described to reporters as the greatest national security emergency Germany had faced since the end of the Cold War. In Paris, the Élysée Palace went into full crisis mode, with the French president canceling all public appearances and summoning his entire National Security Council for an emergency session that lasted through the night. In Warsaw, in Tallinn, in Riga, in every capital along NATO's eastern frontier, the governments most vulnerable to Russian pressure were doing the political equivalent of checking whether the locks on their doors still worked, only to discover that the security company had just gone out of business. And in Brussels, at the heart of the European Union's sprawling bureaucratic empire, Ursula von der Leyen sat behind closed doors and confronted a reality that her entire political career had been constructed to avoid. But what she said next, and what she discovered about Europe's true military capabilities when the American shield was removed, is something that will make everything that came before look like the calm before an absolute storm. Ursula von der Leyen had built her reputation on the architecture of confident declarations. She was the woman who stood before the European Parliament and spoke of European sovereignty with the conviction of someone who believed every word she was saying. She had championed the idea of strategic autonomy. She had pushed for a European defense union. She had given speech after speech about reducing European dependence on American military power, about building a continent capable of defending itself, about Europe finally stepping out of Washington's shadow and standing on its own 2 feet. She had said all of this with such polished, practiced authority that millions of Europeans had believed her, the financial markets had believed her, the think tanks had believed her, even some of her critics had grudgingly accepted that perhaps Europe was slowly, incrementally moving in the right direction. Every single word of it was a fantasy. When the reality of Vance's announcement crashed through the doors of the European Commission like a battering ram, what was revealed underneath all those confident declarations was not a continent quietly building its strategic muscles in preparation for this moment. What was revealed was a house of cards, a beautifully decorated, elaborately furnished, impressively photographed house of cards that had been standing only because the wind had never been allowed to blow. And now the wind had arrived, not as a gentle breeze, but as a hurricane, and the cards were already in the air. The first brutal truth that surfaced within hours of the announcement was one that European defense analysts had been whispering about for years, but that no politician had ever been willing to say out loud in public. Europe, as a collective military force, cannot fight a sustained conventional war without the United States. Not for 6 months, not for 3 months, barely for 6 weeks. The ammunition stockpiles across the continent, even after 2 years of urgent replenishment driven by the war in Ukraine, remain critically below the thresholds required for high-intensity conflict. The artillery shells, the anti-tank missiles, the air defense interceptors, the precision-guided munitions that modern warfare burns through at a terrifying rate, Europe does not have enough of any of them. And without American logistics infrastructure, without American transport aircraft, without American naval support, even moving what stockpiles do exist to where they are needed becomes an operational nightmare that European militaries are not currently equipped to solve. This was not a secret. The classified assessments have been sitting in the filing cabinets of defense ministries across the continent for years. Politicians had read them. grimaced, quietly set them aside, and gone back to cutting defense budgets to fund their domestic political priorities. Because the uncomfortable reality was that, as long as America was there, the consequences of European military weakness remained theoretical. The Americans would handle it. The Americans always handled it. That was the deal, even if nobody said it out loud at diplomatic functions. The deal was now dead. Von der Leyen's emergency address to the European Parliament, delivered just 6 hours after Vance's announcement, was a masterclass in controlled panic dressed up as determined leadership. She stood at the podium with her jaw set and her eyes steady, and she spoke of European resilience and collective resolve and the urgent need for the continent to accelerate its defense investment. She used all the right words in all the right order. But the members of parliament watching her knew, and she knew that they knew, that the words were running about 10 years behind reality, because the defense investment she was now urgently calling for should have happened a decade ago. The manufacturing capacity she was now desperately trying to mobilize should have been built when the warning signs first appeared. The strategic independence she was now framing as Europe's great mission should have been constructed during the years when they had the luxury of time and the comfort of American protection. They had wasted all of it. And while von der Leyen was delivering her carefully worded address, something far more alarming was happening in the intelligence world that the public would not learn about until hours later. When Vance had mentioned restricting the flow of American satellite data and signals intelligence to European partners, most observers had assumed this was a negotiating tactic, a pressure point, a threat designed to bring European governments to the table, rather than an immediate operational reality. They were wrong. Within hours of the announcement, European defense and intelligence agencies began reporting disruptions to the data feeds they had come to rely upon so completely that many of their operational systems had essentially been built around American inputs as a foundational assumption. The implications were staggering, and they cascaded through European military infrastructure like a power failure through a city grid. European air defense networks that relied on American satellite tracking to maintain real-time situational awareness over the continent's eastern approaches suddenly found themselves operating with significant blind spots. The integrated early warning systems that give commanders the precious minutes needed to scramble interceptors and alert populations were now running degraded, like a sophisticated alarm system with half its sensors suddenly switched off. Naval commanders in the Baltic and the Mediterranean, operating vessels equipped with targeting and navigation systems deeply integrated with American satellite constellations, received urgent technical advisories that read, in the bloodless language of military bureaucracy, as the equivalent of being told that the eyes of their ships had just been partially removed. And then came the revelation about the aircraft. Several European air forces operating 4th and 5th generation fighters that had been purchased partly on the basis of their deep interoperability with American systems discovered that, without continuous access to American software, updates, encrypted communication protocols, and satellite-linked navigation data, the operational capabilities of their most advanced aircraft were significantly compromised. These were not cheap, outdated machines. These were the crown jewels of European air power, and they were, to a degree that no defense ministry had ever been willing to publicly acknowledge, dependent on American digital infrastructure to perform at the level their price tags promised. Without the American nervous system, as one senior NATO official described it in a communication that was later leaked to the European press, Europe's most sophisticated military hardware was reduced to operating at a fraction of its design capability. The jets could still take off. The missiles could still be launched, but the precision, the coordination, the seamless integration with allied systems, the battlefield awareness that separates a modern air force from an expensive collection of metal tubes, all of that had been quietly and catastrophically degraded the moment Washington turned off the tap. The wolves at the gates were not unaware of any of this. Within 12 hours of Vance's announcement, Russian state media had shifted its entire editorial posture. Gone were the measured, cautious assessments of American political theater. In their place came something far more revealing. A tone of barely concealed excitement that told observers everything they needed to know about how Moscow was reading the situation. Russian military bloggers with known links to the defense establishment began publishing detailed analyses of European vulnerability windows. Pro-Kremlin commentators who had spent years predicting the collapse of the Western alliance were now writing with the energy of people watching a prediction come true in real time. And along NATO's eastern frontier, in the border regions of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, Local officials began receiving reports of unusual Russian military activity that had not been present the week before. The timing was not a coincidence. It was never going to be a coincidence because Vladimir Putin had been waiting for this moment with the patience of a chess grandmaster who had seen the endgame from the opening moves. He had watched Trump's first term with intense interest. He had observed the fractures in the transatlantic alliance widen with every contentious NATO summit. He had noted every time a European leader privately complained about American unpredictability and every time an American leader publicly questioned whether Article 5 was really worth the price. He had been building toward this moment, positioning his forces, testing European resolve in Ukraine, probing the boundaries of what the West would tolerate, and waiting for the day when the American anchor was finally lifted from the Western alliance and the whole structure began to drift. That day had arrived, and as European governments scrambled to project unity and resolve in their public statements while privately drowning in a flood of crisis assessments, classified threat evaluations, and emergency budget calculations, that all pointed toward the same terrifying conclusion, one question was being asked in every capital from Lisbon to Tallinn, a question that cut through all the diplomatic language and political posturing and landed in the stomach like a piece of cold iron. If Russia moves in the next 6 months before Europe can rebuild even a fraction of what America just took away, who exactly is going to stop them? The emergency calls between European leaders that followed Vance's announcement were not the coordinated, measured diplomatic consultations that press offices later described to journalists. They were panic, raw, unfiltered, behind closed doors, panic from leaders who had spent their entire political careers operating inside the safety net of American power and had never once seriously prepared for the moment that net would be pulled away. Because preparation would have required honesty, and honesty would have required admitting to their own populations that European security was, at its foundation, an American product that Europe was consuming without paying the full price. That admission was now unavoidable. The bill had arrived, and Europe didn't have the money, the military capacity, the manufacturing base, the ammunition stockpiles, the trained personnel, or the unified political will to pay it. Not yet. Not even close. What it had instead was a continent suddenly awake to its own nakedness, staring across its eastern frontier at a Russia that had been preparing for exactly this moment, and staring across the Atlantic at an America that had already turned its back and walked away. Von der Leyen would address the press one final time that evening. She spoke of a new chapter for European sovereignty. She used the word resilience 4 times in 6 minutes. She promised that Europe would rise to meet this historic moment. But behind her eyes, anyone watching closely enough could see it. The cold, dawning, inescapable recognition that the continent she governed had just been left alone in the dark. And somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, something was already moving through the shadows toward the light they had just lost.